Hi, welcome. I'm Corey Kitchen. I'm with the Buena Vista Natural History Museum. Tonight we are doing a Meet the Expert with Dr. Yohe, and the topic is Christian body preparation and burial practices in ancient Egypt. Dr. Yohe is a professor of anthropology at CSUB and has many years of experience in burial practices of Egypt, and has been a professional archaeologist and educator for more than 40 years. He's a published author and has worked for the state on many different archaeological sites and preservation. Without further ado, I'd like to present Dr. Yohe. Thank you.
Good evening, everybody. As I was saying, Egypt was an accident because I had no plans of working in Egypt. And the irony of that, of course, is that whenever anyone heard that I was an archaeologist, they assumed that I worked in Egypt, because obviously all archaeologists must work in Egypt, which is not the case at all. There's an awful lot of archaeology everywhere in the world, and several thousands of archaeologists that specialize in North America. And up until 2003, I was included in that group. But I finally decided to broaden my horizons by going to Egypt. I became immediately enamored with what I saw, and I've been part of the Tell El-Hibeh project ever since, and was made an associate director of the project in 2006. And as luck would have it, sadly, because of the Egyptian Revolution, we lost several years. And upon our return in 2017, we found that significant damage had been made to the site by illicit looters. In fact, it was a band of armed looters in the process of fighting over the tell between the police and the armed looters. Apparently a couple of people were shot, and another looter died because he was excavating a tunnel to try to find a tomb, and the whole ceiling collapsed on him. So it's been a rough past few years when it comes to the research, or I should say lack thereof. But our plan is to return in January, and so my fingers are crossed that we'll get a chance to get back. If not January, maybe sometime during next semester. I do have a sabbatical for this coming semester, so hopefully we'll get a chance to get back there and work again on several projects that were in the works before all of the drama started. So let me see, might as well get my screen share thing going here. Let's see, screen share. And we are going to share, what are we sharing? We're sharing. Ta-da! Everybody should see something that says Death on the Nile, Byzantine style. Is that what you see?
Yes, you're displayed correctly.
Okay, let's hope we can get this thing working. Slideshow from beginning. So this title is a little different from what we had, I had in the announcement. I did want to kind of spend a little more time putting the whole Christian burial situation in context, because the site of Tell El-Hibeh is a huge site complex, and it was occupied perhaps as early as the end of the New Kingdom, but most certainly starting around 1100 BC, and was continually occupied from that time in the beginning of the third intermediate period, all the way up until the time of the Arab incursion that took place in AD 641 and 42. So during that time, Egypt went through immense change. And most of what people think about when they think about Egypt, of course, is either the pyramids of Giza or King Tut. And by the way, a shout out to King Tut and Howard Carter, because this last week was the 100th anniversary of the discovery and opening of Tut's tomb. So 2022 is a big deal in the Egyptological community for that reason. So you'll notice that there's a subtitle here that talks about a Discovery Channel program. And yes, in 2007, we were asked if a film crew could come and work with us in 2007, because they were particularly interested in my work with Christian burials. So that turned out to be a very interesting yet complicated process. And I'll try not to spend too much time on that aspect of it, so we can devote more time specifically to the Byzantine cemetery that I've been working on ever since 2003. And by the way, the site is so huge and there's so much to do that out of necessity, we all have to multitask. And in addition to using my expertise of identifying animal remains, which are abundant at the site, as you can imagine, with over 2,000 years of occupation, there's also a great abundance of human remains, because after the town was depopulated in late Byzantine times, it became a necropolis, which is quite literally a city of the dead, which is what necropolis means. And so anywhere they could stick a body, they stuck a body, whether it's under a wall or next to a large boulder, or they even used old tombs in many cases. So it's a complicated process to try to unravel or separate this palimpsest, all these different events occurring over such a long period of time. But that's part of the excitement as well. It's like one huge three-dimensional puzzle that, you know, it's up to you and your team to try to figure out what's going on. And as I said at the outset, there's been so little work done in this part of the world that really is unknown territory. And on top of that, most of the archaeological research previously has focused heavily on the old kingdom through new kingdom. And of course, new kingdom, I could mention many names and you'd recognize them, because there's been a lot of archaeology associated with the reigns of pharaohs, like the first female pharaoh, Hatshepsut, and the pharaoh Akhenaten, who became monotheistic and made all of Egypt monotheistic as a result. But that was short-lived. And oh yeah, his wife, or one of his wives, was Nefertiti. So there's another name that most people recognize. His son was King Tut, and of course everybody's heard about King Tut. So there's an awful lot that's happening in the end of the new kingdom that most people have heard about, at least. And then of course the Ramesside pharaohs, including Ramses the First, Second, etc. So, but the third intermediate period is basically the beginning of the end. And many archaeologists don't think that it's sexy enough for their attention. So it's been sorely neglected, which was one of the reasons that Dr. Redmount, when she had an opportunity to work with the American Research Center in Egypt, get what's known as a concession. if you're a professional archaeologist and you're willing to commit time and energy to a large project, you can work with the Ministry of Antiquities and get a concession. And we have the concession for El-Hibeh, and our original plan was to work for at least 30 years. It's already almost been 20 years, actually has been 20 years since Dr. Redmount started, and that went by very quickly. And I can't imagine that we're going to be able to get anywhere near where we would like to be in the next 20 years. So this is going to be an ongoing project that will probably last for several decades to come at least. So before I change the slide, two images in addition to the background. First of all, what you're seeing in the background is part of the front wall, the north wall of Tell El-Hibeh, and the north gate. There's a gap. Let's see my little cursor arrow. The gap right here represents what's known as the north gate. So this is the part of the city that people would come through. And it was the area of the city that was most heavily protected, primarily from the north, because in terms of the way politically at the time, this part of Egypt was considered to be the frontier, basically the northern edge of Upper Egypt. Upper Egypt, of course, being controlled out of Luxor. And during the Third Intermediate Period, that fell, even though there were pharaohs in charge, most of them were puppets, because the high priests of Amun were the folks who were really in charge of what was happening. So this area is important because just off to the side where you see people working, here's the arrow again, over here is the Byzantine cemetery. And it's a cemetery that was initiated probably at the first part of the 3rd century AD or CE. And it seems that it was used for at least 200 to 300 years after that. But we'll get into more detail there in a few minutes. But I bring your attention to the portrait in the upper left-hand corner, which is an encaustic painting. And an encaustic painting is the use of colored waxes to produce an effect that's very three-dimensional. And we know that this woman's name was Isidora, because on the inside of the mask is the name Isidora written in Greek. And her hairstyle and her jewelry suggests that she died somewhere between AD 110 and AD 114. So even without radiocarbon dating, we can get a really good estimate of how old this specimen is simply by looking at the hairstyles and the jewelry. And she was made up specifically during the time period in that 1st century, 2nd century AD, where all the women of the upper class had this kind of hairstyle and wore the type of jewelry that she's wearing. This particular mummy mask came from El-Hibeh. We're not exactly sure where, because it was discovered sometime between 1880 and 1900. But it's an interesting question. You know, this is the type of mummification that was done by the Romans. No one else used these mummy portraits like you see in this part of Middle Egypt and in the Fayoum. The other picture that's relevant up on the right-hand corner is an image of Shashank I. And Shashank I came into power at the beginning of the 3rd Intermediate Period, so about 1070 BC. And during that time, the whole reason that this town of El-Hibeh exists is because of a temple that was built to honor Shoshank I. But it was also an attempt to create a fortress in case there was a war between Upper and Lower Egypt. This would be one of the first places that would be hit. And so it was very fortified. That wall that you see in the background, in some places, is as thick as 80 feet and at least 70 feet high. We don't know how much is eroded off. That's another project, is reconstructing the appearance of the town site at its zenith. We haven't been able to do that yet. But Shoshank is important, and this particular engraving came from the temple to Amun that was dedicated to Shoshank, and this particular portrait is at the University of Heidelberg in Germany, because in 1914, a group of German archaeologists came to Tell El-Hibeh and did their excavations. So just to dispel the mythology, when people think about Egypt, this is a great shot because all you see are camels and silhouettes of the pyramids in the background as the sun is setting, and all you see beyond that is desert. And well, that's not exactly how it is. And the other thing that people know about, of course, is Tut. And I don't know if any of you have had the opportunity to see any of the Tut exhibits that have come through the US over the past 40 years or so, but the most recent one was in 2018. And if you had the opportunity to go, it was in Los Angeles, pardon me. And I was able to take I was teaching a class in Egyptian archaeology at the time. So I had an opportunity to take my students there, and we saw artifacts that had never left Egypt previously. So it really was a treat. But I've also been to the Egyptian Museum in Cairo, the old museum, not the new one, which is just, I guess, on the verge of opening up. It's the Grand Giza Museum that is built on the Giza Plateau. But in the old museum, there were 2 floors that were devoted just to the treasures from Tut's tomb, which numbered more than 4,000 pieces. And included in that, of course, is the famous mummy mask of Tut. But the reality of Egypt is a little bit different. From the air, you can see the pyramids, and you can see that there's some desert, but it's right on the edge of this massive city. You have to remember that Cairo is the largest city in the Arab world. It has 18 million inhabitants. So it truly is, as the population grows, it encroaches further and further upon these major archaeological resources, many of which haven't been fully excavated or completely understood. So really, archaeologists are in a race against time to try to document and excavate as much as possible before this encroachment gets worse. And we have it at El-Hibeh as well. Because just in the time we've been working there, the water table has risen significantly, which is causing damage to the temple that you'll get a chance to see. Plus, the other problem is that the arable land, the farming fields are getting closer and closer to the site, and especially at the southern end. And that's problematic because that area is still covered with archaeological resources. We know that because I did a test excavation at the southern end of the Tell in 2003. So there's areas that we can no longer get to that still have vital archaeological information. One of the most important things about our approach to archaeology in Egypt now compared to the way that it used to be is that it truly has become multidisciplinary. And as a result of that, it's allowed us to do some amazing things. For example, the reconstruction of King Tut and how he appeared. We have to remember that he came into power when his father Akhenaten died. He was only 8 years old. You know, he was just a kid and he was pharaoh. Of course, his vizier was pulling most of the strings behind the scenes. And there's been a lot of speculation as to whether he died, whether he was murdered or died because of natural causes. He had a severe injury to his foot, and it appears that it had become infected. So it's quite possible that that is what has killed him. But between the use of modern medical imaging and DNA analysis, a number of things that we supposed were the case but couldn't be sure about, including these two infants that were mummified in the tomb, human infants with Tut. And it was assumed that they were probably, you know, his children. And it wasn't until DNA was extracted from them that it was determined that, yeah, they were in fact his children. So this new multidisciplinary approach has allowed us to expand our knowledge dramatically. And of course, Egypt it's like one large archaeological site. You can't throw a rock without hitting something important archaeologically anywhere along the Nile. And that's the key to it right there, is that there's such an intensification of population along the Nile because the land was so rich. The land was rich because of annual flooding. In fact, the name for Egypt, Kemet, is, you know, basically means black soil, or the place of black soil. And that black soil, of course, is the rich, fertile soils that fill the Nile corridor. The largest part being on the delta, where the Nile expands into several tributaries and then ultimately dumps into the Mediterranean. But as you go further south, excuse me, that corridor becomes narrower and narrower. Excuse me a moment, I have to take a drink because I'm losing my voice. Sorry about that. Oh yeah, just that slide's actually out of place. I meant that slide to be before the other one, but yeah, we've been able to do more accurate reconstructions, again, because of combination of medical technology and working with forensic anthropologists. So Tell El-Hibeh, as I said, is in an area where we know very little about any period, let alone the third intermediate period, which, as I said at the beginning, is considered to be the beginning of the fall of the Egyptian Empire. It's during this time that there are several invasions, Persians, Assyrians, ultimately the armies of Alexander the Great, and then eventually even the Romans. So it's a complex and but fascinating record, and it's even more interesting as an archaeologist to try to tease out from what we find those changes that were brought into the country as many of these other superpowers started expanding their territories, like Persia and Macedonia, and then ultimately the Roman Empire. I mentioned the Shashank Temple. This is one of the reasons that Tell El-Hibeh exists. It doesn't look very, doesn't look tourist worthy, let's just put it that way. And in a sense, that's good, because if it's not well known, it's probably not going to be as attractive to looters as a lot of other sites are. But we learned, unfortunately, that even a site like this, which has a rich archaeological record, to be sure, the looters, and I think the problem is that the looters showed up and they saw that we had built this major complex of, part of the infrastructure that we had to build were site labs and buildings for storage equipment, and we had to build a special unit for the site guards. So, and the Ministry of Antiquity ended up putting a sign up, and I think that might have been a mistake, because sometimes signs are an indication, oh, they thought it was important enough to put up a sign to identify it. It must have lots of good stuff for us to steal. So it's one of the great tragedies of archaeology is that irrespective of where you are, whether it's the Mojave Desert or some remote place in Egypt, looters have generally hit any place that has been around or known about for any period of time. It is very rare to find an archaeological site that has not been completely devastated by looting activity. And the temple, historically, and we learned this from my excavations of the Byzantine cemetery, as we started to excavate that cemetery, we found big chunks of limestone that had been taken from this temple. It literally had to move some of these blocks, that weighed 300 and 400 pounds. They would move them more than a quarter of a mile to the opening of the north gate and put them over a mass burial. And we know that because it turns out that one of the blocks that was uncovered is in fact has an image of Shashank on it. So yeah, it came from this temple. So there's a history of this temple being built and then falling into disrepair and then being restored. And then ultimately, when Christianity became the state religion during Roman times, anything that was pagan was pretty much destroyed. And this particular temple was remote enough that and the marble was, limestone was of good enough quality that they reused a lot of it. So, and to that point, there's a lot of native limestone that is part of the town site. So this is a tomb. This is a shaft tomb. You can see the steps that are carved into the side here. If all this debris was cleaned out, there would be an entrance into a tomb. This was probably looted the first time, probably within weeks of when it was first sealed. So the other problem is that looting is not a recent phenomenon. Looting has been going on since ancient times and has just continued. Well, we're going to talk a little more about this particular individual mummy, but this is one of the Byzantine mummies that I've been working with. And he has the name of NGLP number 7, because he was the 7th mummy that we found in what we call the North Gate looter pit. So we just shortened that to NGLP. But since this is the mummy that was used in the Discovery Channel program, they had to give him a name. So they called him Arsani. I refused to use that name because that wasn't his name, I'm sure. So out of respect, he's still NGLP 7, but we'll get back to him. Just to put things in context, I know it says Berkeley, but we could run down the valley to Bakersfield and it's still about the same distance, or 7,000 miles between the Pacific coast and where El-Hibeh is. And it's literally halfway around the world. And this just shows one of the things that has really been useful to us in terms of modern equipment is satellite imagery. And things like Google Earth have become invaluable tools because you can use them ahead of time to, survey areas basically and look for landmarks and possible tombs. I mean, it's just been within the last 5 years that an Egyptian archaeologist working close to Meidum, which is in Lower Egypt, she found a whole new set of pyramids that were unknown, even though they were in an area where archaeologists have been working for a long time. She saw the details from the air that couldn't be seen from the ground, and they were actually able to go and do some excavations and determine that this is a major discovery. So I never know who's going to be in these sessions, so I spend a little time on geography, because one of the great tragedies of modern education is that geography has been pretty much left out of most curricula. And so I get students, freshmen and sophomores, they can't tell me where Africa is or where South America is, or for that matter, where anything is. And I find that extremely disturbing for a number of reasons. So I'm certain that everybody who's here today knows where Egypt is, but you don't know where El-Hibeh is until I show you. And here again, it's south of Beni Suef and about 130 miles south of Cairo. So it is quite rural. The city that we are closest to, in fact, we live in, is called El Fashion. And El Fashion has a population of about 45,000 people, most of whom are farmers. And of course, the area is filled with very rich fields. And one of the major crops there now is maize, which is an introduced crop because maize is a New World domesticate that was developed in Mexico beginning around 9,000 years ago. So to see that most of the fields, instead of being the traditional, in the past, it would have been wheat and barley and einkorn, but now it's banana trees and maize. I don't use the word corn simply because that leads to a lot of confusion, because corn specifically means any type of seed. It can be a grain of barley, it can be a grain of rice. So when you use the word corn to describe maize, it can be very confusing, which is one of the, if you read a lot of British literature, they use the term corn all the time when they're referring to cereal grains. And that has led to some embarrassing mistakes in certain I saw a National Geographic documentary, I swear. It showed ancient Egyptians harvesting maize. And I just about, my jaw dropped and I was horrified. And I thought, this is what happens when people, don't look beyond, they hear the word corn and they immediately assume maize. There was no maize in Egypt until it was introduced in the 18th and 19th centuries. Anyway, this is just another, I show this particular slide. This is great satellite imagery, and El-Hibeh is within that red circle, and everything to the right of it is desert, and it's real desert. We're talking about, it might as well be on the moon. That is the kind of desert we're talking about here. So, and off to the left, and of course you can see the Nile, and to the left of that, it's part of that Nile corridor area that is within the floodplain. And in antiquity, there was an annual flood. and that annual flood recharged the soils. And it was absolutely necessary. If that didn't happen, people would starve. And then on a few occasions, there were some climatic fluctuations which put large amounts of the Egyptian population at risk in antiquity. But for the most part, it wasn't a problem. Unfortunately, when the high dam was put in down in Aswan back in the 1960s, that kept the floods from occurring, the annual flooding. So that means that the government had to subsidize all the farmers by providing free fertilizer. And it's really a lot of the people who are farming today, they never had the opportunity to farm the old way, which was you'd let the floods do their thing, and when the water receded, it was time to plant. That's a long time ago now. And so you have a generation of farmers that never had that Egyptian experience, and something that had been going on for at least 7,000 or 8,000 years no longer occurred because of the dam. So we've already talked about where El-Hibeh is. And here's a nice aerial photograph in the upper left-hand corner. I always tell my students, it looks like a slice of pizza that someone took a bite out of the corner, because it's basically triangular in shape, or it would be a triangle if we didn't have this big chomp mark on it. And you can see the north wall very clearly and a number of standing features. Interestingly enough, most of the mud brick features that are standing at the site today date to the Roman occupation. So most of them between the 1st century AD all the way up to Byzantine times. So the real name of El-Hibeh, because El-Hibeh is the name of a village that's south of where we're working. And by the way, a tell, spelled T-E-L-L, is a mountain, or in this case, a tell refers to a town mound, a place where people lived for a long period of time. And as their mud brick buildings started to fall into disrepair, they would just push them over and build new ones on top. And because of that behavior, what was initially just a bit of high ground above the floodplain turns into this deep archaeological deposit that's in some places 100 feet deep. That is a deep archaeological deposit. So we're within about 40 miles of the Fayum Depression, and those Roman encaustic mummy portraits that I was talking about at the beginning, most of them occur in the Fayum, but it also, it turns out that El-Hibeh is one of the few places beyond the Fayum where there's also the same kind of mummy portraits being made. So we've already seen that. This is a great view because you can see standing architecture. This area of limestone is part of a temple. We don't know the temple to whom, which of the gods. We know that the main temple that I showed you the foundation of, that was built in honor of the god Amun, who became very important at the beginning of the Third Intermediate Period, almost to the exclusion of, Osiris and Ra, which previously had been the major deities of concentration. But during this particular period, Amun took on new significance. And another view of that north wall, it almost looks like a natural geological feature, but nope, that's all mud brick. We're talking about hundreds of thousands of individual mud bricks. So my goodness, how is that even, it seems unfathomable, especially on those parts of the wall that are close to 80 feet thick. And up close, this is one of the walls that's on the desert side of the tell. And you can see the individual mud bricks. The young lady who's standing there pointing up is Virginia Emery. She was a student from the University of Chicago working on this project. She finished her master's degree and is currently working on her PhD, I believe. What we're seeing on the right, though, is one of the mud bricks with a stamp. And the stamp is of the cartouche of a high priest of Amun. And we can see that the name in the cartouche is on this side, and it reads Men Kefer Ray. So we know that Men Kefer Ray was in power when this brick was made, because the bricks are stamped. It's part of, I don't know, the vanity of the high priest of Amun in Luxor. But it turns out to be an important archaeological tool, because we know when those particular priests were in power. Another one during this time is Penujum. So if we've got Menkeferre, and we also have some of Penujum, Penujum came at a later date than Menkeferre. So that can be useful. This is just another view of the temple. Every year that we go back, the temple is hidden by what's known as elephant grass, and it grows to be about 6 to 7 feet tall. So it completely obscures the temple. So this is after we spent a lot of time and effort removing all of that so we could start working on the temple. This is one of the reliefs from the temple, and it's of Shashank. And Shashank is one of only 2 major pharaohs he's mentioned in the Bible. And Shashank, sometimes his name occurs in the Bible as Shishak, but it's the same guy because he expanded. He was one of the last pharaohs to expand the boundaries of Egypt to include the Levant. So, which of course is, Israel and Jordan and Syria, Palestine. That whole area was under Egyptian control during Shashank's reign. Just a montage of imagery to show you the desertness of the eastern side of the Tell, as well as the quality of preservation. If you look in the lower right-hand corner, that is a coffin lid made from wood. It's made from cedar. It's high quality wood. What's missing is the mask, which is something that is generally easily stolen and sold on the black market, which is very unfortunate, but it's a common problem at the site. Just 2 detailed maps, and this is more showing that you can do a pretty good job with an old school optical transit, but it's still never going to be as good as the maps that we can make using GPS technology. And so the map on the left was made by the University of Washington in 1980. The map on the right is one that Berkeley did in 2002 and 2003, when we established a 50-meter grid over the entire site. And what's nice about this is that we can use the aerial photography or the satellite imagery to check our maps to see that they're as accurate as we think they should be. Because what we do is take our GPS readings, and of course, GPS stands for global positioning systems. I had a momentary brain fart there. And we can download those data into mapping programs that can produce some really accurate maps. As I said earlier, Hibeh is important because it's really a key site to understanding an Egyptian Dark Age and the 3rd intermediate period. Anytime you have an intermediate period, and this is the 3rd intermediate period, there is one between the Old Kingdom and the Middle Kingdom, and there was one between the Middle Kingdom and the New Kingdom. And basically that's a time of political turmoil and conflict. We have to remember that there are essentially 40 different states that exist within ancient Egypt. They were called nomes, and they were established very early in Egypt's history, probably during the pre-dynastic period. So sometimes there was great harmony between the nomes. Sometimes there was great conflict, and it really depended on the strength of the pharaoh in charge, or the lack of that strength. That depended on whether or not there was a lot of conflict or no conflict. So when we look at a chronological list here, from the oldest all the way down to the appearance of the Arabs in the 7th century AD, we can see that it's the last half of ancient Egypt that El-Hibeh provides us information on. I include New Kingdom because we think it's possible that there was a New Kingdom settlement there prior to it being chosen to build the temple of Amun to honor Shashank I, but also to show the power of the high priests of Amun. But we don't have good scientific evidence of that yet. But we know that during the Third Intermediate period, that yes, indeed, there was a lot of work going on there, which I can't believe that there was nothing and then they decided to put a town there. And so that's one of the things that we're looking for, and haven't been lucky enough up to this point to find any of those data, mostly because they're going to be at the bottom of the deposit. So important periods, of course, the Hellenistic period is important because that's when Alexander the Great and his hordes and his army came in, became part of the Macedonian Empire, and then ultimately became part of Egypt. When Alexander the Great died, all of the generals of Alexander fought over bits and pieces of the empire, and the the general Ptolemy got Egypt. So that's the beginning of what's known as the Ptolemaic dynasty, which lasts about 300 years until the Romans defeat Cleopatra VII and Mark Antony. Their navy essentially wiped out their navy at the Battle of Actium in 31 BC. Another thing that distinguishes El-Hibeh is that there are a lot of really important papyrus documents that come from there. And I don't have time to talk about all of those, but it was one of the major reasons that Egyptologists started working at Hibeh back at the end of the 19th and beginning of the early 20th century. This is most of the tale of Ween Amun, which is, we're not sure whether it is an actual event or whether it's a story. Stories aren't that common in the Egyptian literature from this particular time. So it probably is about a real person, but we don't have the last few pages, so we don't even know how it ends. But the fact that we have papyrus documents at all is a big deal. And it's also a testament to the aridity of the area, which is why we get good preservation of wood. These are some sarcophagi that were excavated by the University of Heidelberg back in 1914. And one of the biggest disappointments to those of us who are bioarchaeologists that deal with human skeletal materials is that these mummies would be destroyed to get papyrus documents, because papyrus would be recycled. They would use it to make paper mache to cover the mummies, and then they put plaster over that and then paint that, and it would look really nice. It would look like a very expensive cedar sarcophagus, even though it was just made of paper mache. So in the early part of the 20th century, a lot of Egyptologists would tear the mummies apart to get the cartonnage, and they throw the bodies away. So that is devastating to those of us that do those studies. This is one of the coffins that the University of Heidelberg recovered from El-Hibeh, and it shows the preservation of details. In this instant, it's the god Nut, who is responsible for holding up the sky, and she's commonly found as a figure in coffins. And here are some Roman mummies that were found in 1901 by Grenfell and Hunt, and they have those mummy portraits that I talked about earlier. And here's Isidora. We were introduced to her earlier. If you want to see her, she's on display at the Getty Museum in Malibu, the Getty Villa. So if you get an opportunity to go to the Getty Villa, make sure you see Isidora. So we've already kind of covered some of this material, and I want to get through here. I will mention that we're fortunate enough to have a 7,500 square foot, 4-story villa that's right on the Nile. And it's almost embarrassing because it's really nice, and the rooms are air conditioned. It didn't start out that way. We had to work a lot and spend a lot of money to fix it up, but it's really quite fantastic now. And it's only a 15-minute commute to the site. We have to cross the river on the ferry. We're only half a block from the ferry landing. So we load up our van and go across the Nile and do then on to Hibeh, which is only about a 10-minute drive from there. So we had everything that you see in this picture, we had to build. And the reason for that is that you cannot take any archaeological materials off-site. I mean, we had to negotiate to be able to take materials to study to our facility that we built. This is where we put our equipment. This is where we store artifacts. And this is also where the guards have a place that they live so that they can be somewhat comfortable when they're guarding the site. So all this infrastructure is not cheap. And we also had to bring electricity and running water to this part of the village of El-Ugra, the village that we're closest to. And if this photograph was angled just a little more to the north, we'd see some of the buildings of the town of El-Ugra. And those folks were very delighted that we brought electricity and water to that area, because previously they didn't have that. And to us, it wasn't terrible. I mean, it was costly to be sure, but it was something that the local farmers could never have afforded to do. So it was a win-win. We got our facilities, they got electricity and water to their southern part of the village. So this is my osteology laboratory before it's full of junk. As the season goes on, there's more stuff accumulating in here. This is the sign, which I tell people, the bad thing about these signs is the arrow generally means dig here. It's an unfortunate fact that by advertising these sites, you actually open them up to looting. The middle part of the Tell, where there's standing architecture, we call the Roman town, because all these buildings date to the Roman period. And the temple to Shashank, this is the most recent reconstruction based on the work done by the University of Heidelberg and more recent studies by an architect who's also a student of Egyptian archaeology and a computer whiz. So he made a 3D reconstruction. You can actually take a tour through the temple if you go to the website where he has this posted. So if you're interested, it's really quite interesting to check out. And as I said, we've got water problems encroaching. The water table is high, which causes this limestone in the temple to exfoliate. So that's an ongoing problem. And this is just the excavation to show you how things change during the Roman occupation of Egypt, when it was a province of Rome, this is an administrative building, and they used blocks from the temple to incorporate into their structure. So now, and years later, the Coptic Christians came and took a lot of those pieces to cover up their burials. So there was a great deal of time. We recognize that the Temple of Amun probably was not being used during the time of the Roman occupation. We have both the marble, but we also have mud brick construction. This is just one of our plan drawings. Quickly, because I want to get to the meat of things, but I also wanted to give you enough background to put it into context. Everything that you see with letters that are designated on this map are places that we have excavated. So you can see that we've done very little. We haven't even scratched the surface. And most of what I've done has been salvage. Here's the NH2 excavations. This is in the floodplain. So we never thought that there would be anything there, but putting a couple of test units in, we found architecture, and including, this is a room that would have been occupied by a small family. The water jug is still intact in the back of the structure. There's entryway here. There's another entryway that was covered up with large pieces of pottery for some reason. We're not sure why. This feature is a great anomaly, and it shows up clearly in all the aerial imagery that we have. And from accounts from the 1890s, the thinking at the time is that it was a crocodile necropolis. You might say, a what? This is a place where they would store, and they'd have a temple to the god Sobek, and they would store mummies for the time of the year that there were celebrations of the god Sobek, which is a crocodile god. And I've scoured the interior of this on my hands and knees. I've not found one crocodile tooth or crocodile scoot or plate. There's nothing that I found that's crocodile. So, but it's also been horribly looted, and they've dynamited the place that was the temple had been dynamited. So, and the Coptic Christians around the 4th century AD started burying bodies in the mud brick wall. Oh, by the way, this is the god Sobek, and this is a reconstruction of the god Sobek wearing the Atif crown and holding an ankh in one hand and a scepter in the other. And here are crocodile mummies. Who knew? There are all kinds of animal mummies, by the way, tens of thousands, probably millions of them. Cats, ibises, baboons, crocodiles that all represent various gods. In the case of the crocodile, the god Sobek. So it's conceivable that this is a temple to Sobek, but we don't have evidence. But what we did do, the geophysicist on the project, Dr. Maury Morgenstein, brought a portable mass spectrometer and was able to determine, this is what it looks like. This is the Niton portable EDXRF device that we can use for mud brick studies. So, and also try to figure out how many work teams were involved and where the mud came from to build that structure. So we've got all these areas with numbers, or areas where samples of soils were taken, and they sort out, these two areas sort out in terms of the trace elements. You've got two groups, you got group 1 and group 2. So the question was, if you take enough samples from the structure, and we can see where the samples were taken, and there are 50 from the structure, we should be able to get an idea. And sure enough, there's group 1 over here and group 2, which indicates, when we look at the numbers, that work gang 1 put the north corner together, and work gang 2 did the southeastern part of the temple, which is kind of interesting, but it also shows the importance of using high technology to try to better understand ancient human behavior. There'd been no other way to figure this out without that technology. I mean, we know about brick making and we know how important it was. And people continued to make bricks for structures up till the 1970s when the Egyptian government made it illegal to do so because they thought it was dangerous. It's not, because there's still mud brick walls standing that are thousands of years old. But so between these images and our scientific data, we've got an idea of, there were two different work groups. We can figure out the numbers of, generally, we're looking at a group of about 20 individuals for both work groups. Another thing that was big about this site, as it turns out, was making pottery. And this is a pottery kiln. And there's Ms. Emery again, serving as scale for this kiln, which would have been, you can see it's covered with mud brick. The interior is ceramic, and then it would be covered with plaster. And of course, the plaster is all gone. But when I got there in 2003, my job was to assess the damaged human remains and set up a list of priorities that needed to be addressed in terms of salvage and research. And this is a little limestone solution cave that we call BC1, or Burial Cave 1, because it was full of mummies. When I got there in 2003, unfortunately, a child mummy and an adult male mummy had been pretty much destroyed, as you can see the picture on the left here. On the right, you can see pieces of coffin wood that came out of BC1. So there were coffins in there. And this is what BC1 looked like in 2001. In the next 2 years, this is what it looked like. So that shows the kind of damage that is ongoing, and that's with guards. Can you imagine during the Arab Spring when there were no guards and this place was actually inhabited by a team of about 10 armed looters? Very disturbing. But as an archaeologist, you have to learn how to deal with what there is. And in this case, this was looted in antiquity. It's a Roman tomb. They didn't get much for their efforts because generally in these late Roman tombs, they're not buried with much in the way of burial goods. And all of these are human bones. They were all collected, and I tried to determine the minimum number of individuals. Turns out there were at least 16 people represented here. And from the ages of about 10 years of age up until older than 50, which in ancient Egyptian times, if you lived past 50, that was a big deal. By looking at the census records that the Romans did in the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd centuries AD, the average age at death was mid-20s. And if you made it into the mid-30s, you were doing really well. There's also a very high infant mortality rate. So, which is another important reason for studying the human remains, is to get an idea of the human biology and how it changed over time. And one of the things that we consistently find is a condition called cribra orbitalia, where you've got in the upper part of your eye orbits. Let's see, do I just happen to have a human skull here? This is a cast, but with cribra orbitalia in the upper part of the orbits here, if you see a porosity, that is evidence of anemia. And anemia is generally caused by schistosomiasis, which is endemic in the Nile, which is one of the reasons you don't swim in the Nile. As much as I would like to say I swim in the Nile, I can't even think about it because schistosomiasis is so prevalent, and about 30% of the modern Egyptian population is afflicted with it. It's a parasite that burrows through your skin. The larva gets into your bloodstream. Male and females mate in the liver and then move to the bladder for the female to lay her eggs. And that does the body doesn't react well to those eggs, and it causes kidney problems, bladder cancer, all sorts of terrible things. In fact, men bleeding through their urethras was so commonplace that it was thought that men had a monthly cycle just like women did. And that seems really bizarre to us, but they didn't understand. They didn't know what the problem was. They just assumed it was part of life. But it was also something that contributed to the death of people. So BC1, this is one of my former graduate students in the lower right-hand corner. And we're inside trying to make sense of all the damage, all the mummies that you see in the back there. They date from Ptolemaic to Roman times, but they were horribly torn apart. Here's another graduate school student who's laying there for scale. Unfortunately, the feet, hands, and heads on all the mummies had been cut off. And that was just in 1 year, because the year before, when I first noted them and checked them out, they were complete. So I was excited to be able to go back and find complete mummies, but unfortunately that wasn't the case. But we persevered. We screened using small 1/8-inch mesh screens, so we get the small beads and amulets and such. We found parts of mummy masks. Here's one here that was broken that would have covered the face of the deceased. But NGLP is the area where the Christian burials are. And in 2003, this was the first burial that I saw that was eroding out. And then I started seeing others. And so this got prioritized, this and BC1, NGLP and BC1 were on the list for us to address in 2004. And that's what we did. And you can see, as it turned out, this cemetery was dug into a Roman dump. And we know that that Roman dump dated to about the 2nd century AD because of the type of pottery we found in it. Again, pottery is really useful because some of it is extremely temporally sensitive, and some was only made for a short period of time, others for longer periods of time. But there was a particular type of pottery, Byzantine ware, which was used primarily in the 2nd century AD during the Roman period. So it turns out there were several trenches dug here, and bodies were literally stacked in those trenches. We're excavating a mummy up in the upper left-hand corner. And then here at the lower part, we see yet another individual, and this is a male, an adult male. The X-ray evaluations that we got suggest that he was probably in his mid-30s when he died. Remember I talked about a block that came from the temple? You can kind of see in the upper right-hand corner, there's some hieroglyphs, and then there's the image of the Pharaoh Shoshank. So that's the only image of Shoshank that has ever been found away from the temple. So if I had to say what was one of the most exciting finds that I ever had, that was probably it, because that's kind of a big deal. But how did we know that these were Christian mummies? Well, first of all, the first hint was that they all were oriented with their heads to the west, or what we call west-headed burials. So that's the first indication, because earlier periods, there's not always any kind of special orientation. It's also the time period too, because the bodies were treated differently. And our mummies looked like the mummies that you see in this picture, which are Coptic mummies from a place called Carrara that's about 30 miles south of El-Hibeh. And then this is NGLP, and there are a bunch of government officials sitting there, well, watching us work. So that's what they got paid to do. So, and you can see here, trenches and the bodies were literally stacked one on top of the other, which was curious and suggested to me either some kind of epidemic or some type of warfare. And it turns out that the warfare hypothesis actually was supported by some data we'll see in a second here. But you can see in 2004, there's a trench here and a trench here, bodies buried, in some instances, 4 and 5 deep in each of these trenches. So they were all buried at about the same time. So that indicates that there was some major event that resulted in the death of a large number of people. And we did get some radiocarbon dates, and this particular mummy didn't have a radiocarbon date, but it was found in a same trench with a mummy that dated to about AD 250. And this is just about the time when Christianity is becoming a major force in Egypt, even though Egypt is still a pagan country, and won't be a Christianized country completely until the end of the 4th century AD. Just show where all the mummies that we saw in the NGLP in 2004 and then 2005, we removed 2 additional mummies and recorded 3 others that we would also like to recover, but I doubt they're still there. This is just an archaeologist's greatest friend turns out to be compressed air, because you can't use a brush easily to clean these guys off, but that compressed air works beautifully. So we have several boxes of those ready, because the best way to move these bodies or clean these bodies up. One of the things that made these bodies unique, though, I've worked with a lot of mummies and they're really light. And even though these bodies were wrapped in flax linen, which could add some weight, they were still too heavy. So I thought something unusual was going on with these bodies. This was the second mummy that we salvaged in 2005. What was interesting about this mummy is it appeared to be later, about 200 years later, and it was also buried with tunics. This individual was buried with 3 tunics. And you can see that their preservation is not perfect, but some of the design elements, such as the peacock that you see in the upper right-hand corner, in this clavis, which is a design feature that goes over the shoulder. And then this is a rondelle in the upper left-hand corner. And then we have a wool patch with different colors that has been attached to flax linen for the tunic. This is not any tunic that we found. That this is an example of a rare intact tunic from, we don't know where in Egypt, because most of these were on the antiquities market, and most museums that have collections of Coptic materials, they have no provenance. So that makes our bodies particularly important, because we can actually place an individual and know things about that individual. Turns out this individual with the tunics was only about 17 or 18 years old. He'd already had a pretty rough life and had a couple of herniated discs. So he was doing hard labor. We're not sure what killed him, but the fact that he died at such a young age is fairly consistent with, as I said, the Roman census data. So in 2005, I got permission to do a necropsy on this particular mummy. This is NGLP 7, I mentioned earlier. And the first incision, the idea was I wanted to keep the wrapping as intact as possible. So I made a cut around the center of the body so that I could lift half of it like a lid and expose the body within. And that's what I did. Dr. Jill Gardner was helping me. She's also a human osteologist. And you can see as I'm parting this cut here, you can see a lot of white. And it turns out that this body was literally packed in natron. Well, what's so special about natron? Natron is what was used for thousands of years, beginning about 4,500 years ago, to make mummies. Only to make a mummy requires a specialist, and you have to take the body to these mortuary specialists, and they remove all the organs and stuff the body with linen that is soaked in various types of resins, and then they dry the put the body in piles of natron for about 70 days just to completely desiccate them. In fact, the tissue really looks like jerky. I'm not kidding. And that's essentially what it is. It's human muscle tissue that has all the water drawn out of it, which is helpful, of course, in the preservation because it's the moistness that allows decomposition. So why were they packing these guys? This explains the heavy mummies, but why were they doing this? And the fact that they dated to a period of time when this particular fellow, Christianity had spread into Egypt beginning around AD 27. And so over the next couple of hundred years or so, a lot of people converted to Christianity. And one of the first things that happened in the 5th century, well, the 4th and 5th century, is that mummification became illegal. So, yeah, in the old days, mummification was a big process that was both practical, like it was an embalming service basically, but it was also religious. And the lead embalmist would wear a mask of Anubis during the process of reading special prayers and sacred words to Anubis and to Osiris to make sure that this person would be protected when they went to the afterlife. Well, that went away when paganism was swept to the side. And when initially Christians were demonized in Egypt, but that changed dramatically within about a 50-year period. So by about the time we get to AD 390, Egypt and the Roman Empire is pretty much converted to Christianity. So that Theodosius I was a Roman emperor that if you did anything pagan, it was considered to be a death sentence. So in fact, he was excommunicated because he killed all the people in a village that were still practicing pagan activities. So this period is interesting because you have all these influences from earlier times and later times. And to give you an example, this is what the god Horus, who's a major god in the Egyptian pantheon, here on the right-hand side, as he would be shown normally up through Ptolemaic times. On the left here, we have an image of Horus in Roman military wear on a horse with Roman tack and saddle, basically. So there's this interesting transition from, in the fact that the Romans even considered these gods to be important up until the advent of Christianity, the fact that the Roman Empire, when it finally became Christian, this sort of thing disappeared from the archaeological record. This is another example, which there's still hints of paganism that show up in Christian iconography. You can see Anubis here on the left in a Ptolemaic panel, and on the right, here are two dog-faced saints that are, this is from a Coptic panel that was painted in the 17th century AD. So there are little bits of ancient iconography and imagery that still shows up even in these later Christian pieces. So the way mummies used to be done worked pretty well. And the important thing was to get all the organs out and the brain out, and to make sure the body cavity was cleaned out with strong palm alcohol, and then treated with powdered myrrh and other resins that had antimicrobial properties, and then drying out the body on top of that, and then covering the body with resin once that was all done. In some cases, the body was also covered with bitumen, which we call tar, but interestingly, the name mummy is derived from the Arabic word mumia, and mumia means asphalt or bitumen. So that's where the word comes from. But this is a New Kingdom mummy of one of the Ramses. And to give you an idea of how important mummification was, this individual was a Roman general, and this was how his body was prepared initially, and then he was wrapped in several layers of linen. So in his case, his mummy was really heavy because it was packed, he was wrapped in dense linen, in some cases up to 100 yards or more, which is expensive, by the way. And then he was put into a sarcophagus made out of wood. It's the final bit. So even the poorest of families tried to have mummification, because starting about 3,500 years ago, there was kind of a democratization of mummification. In the old days, only the pharaoh and his noble men could be, and their wives could be mummified. But as time went on, everybody could be mummified and had an equal chance to getting into the afterlife. Oh yeah, this is a mummy this is Boris Karloff from the 1932 movie, The Mummy. And it's actually a pretty good job. Not perfect, but he's missing a lot of things that he should have had being a mummy. Here are some examples of Roman mummies. And again, they've got the Fayum type mummy portraits. This red mummy, by the way, came from El-Hibeh. But two things happened in the 4th century that made it completely illegal to do mummification. And that was Saint Anthony, the Egyptian Saint Anthony, who proclaimed that mummification was a sin. So there was that. And then the Emperor Theodosius, who was very zealous in his enthusiasm for Christianity, and he decreed that mummification could not take place. Well, even though people may have adopted Christianity, there was a lot of holdover of the ideas that in order to get in the afterlife, you need to be identifiable. And the only way to be identifiable is to be mummified. But the only way to do that surreptitiously would be to pack the bodies in natron and then wrap them up and bury them. So they literally would mummify in the ground, which was the case with NGLP7. Every place that there was lots of natron, you get good soft tissue preservation, including the eye. His right eye is really well preserved. You can see the orbicularis oris muscle there intact, as well as the lens of the eyes, which is kind of creepy, but also quite fascinating. Retention of the hair, very curly, about 10 centimeters in length, which is consistent with what we would expect. Here are two mummy portraits from that same time period, and we can see long curly hair in both of these men. But back to what caused these people to be buried all at the same time. What happened? Well, if you look at the back of the head here of NGLP7, he's got a really deep depressed fracture, which led to this huge radiating fracture that continues through all the way to the frontal bone. So pretty massive strike to the back of the head. And it's kind of oblong, which is why I put an oval here instead of a circle. You can see it better in this angle. That was a big hit, and there's no healing. So this was a fatal wound. It's interesting to note that's on the back of the head because it indicates he was running. He also has a number of cut marks on the top of his head. So I'm not sure if he was maybe scalped afterwards. There's something going on. And that's another, I didn't really look at that in detail the last time I was in Egypt because I didn't have the time, but that's on my list of things to do. And just another close-up image showing the depth of the depressed fracture there. And there it is showing, we did get a chance to x-ray him, and you can, doesn't really show up all that well, but it is right there. Now, what did it? Well, the first thing came to mind was some type of mallet, some kind of war mace. And there are a lot of depictions of pharaohs and hunters using maces for hunting, but also in warfare. Here we see a mace being used. Usually every pharaoh that is depicted on a major temple is shown smiting an enemy, and they smite that enemy with a mace. So we thought, maybe a mace. Here we've got a god who has a mace and a pharaoh with a mace, and they're both going after the enemy. And this is a typical mace head, but the nature of the fracture being oval doesn't seem to support that. So what does support it, and it was the first thing that I really thought of, was a sling bullet. This is a Roman sling bullet here, and it's just about the right size to make this kind of impression. And it turns out that most Roman regiments had groups of those people that just did using slingshots in their as part of the arsenal. So the use of a sling was very important in warfare in ancient Egypt. But taking a look at some of the x-rays, we found examples of damage, like the spiral fracture of this femur, of this female. That's the type of injury you would get, you know, falling off of a wall or a horse or being run over by a chariot. You don't get that wound just by, you know, slipping. This is a younger person, so no evidence of osteoporosis. This is a spiral fracture. It is a result of some kind of major violent act. So since we're running out of time, or we've run out of time, I just kind of, to summarize, and I would like to come back at some other time to talk about some of the other things that we have been able to do in our time in Egypt, including working on the tomb that's in the next few slides. The evidence we have, in the way that I presented it in my joint publication with my colleagues, is that what we're seeing is a time of transition, that bodies were still being mummified in essence without any of the officials, especially the church officials, being aware of it. And over time that changed, because one of the other mummies that dates to a much later time period, the 5th century AD, there's only a sprinkling of natron on the body. It's not packed. And so we've got the bodies that are packed in natron versus one that's 200 years later that also has 3 tunics, but just a ritual sprinkling. And if you look at the Coptic literature, it talks about ritual use of natron and that it was sprinkled on bodies in the 5th and 6th centuries AD. So I think what we're seeing here is the evolution and transition from pagan techniques of mummification to one that was more consistent with the belief system of Christianity. So I could go on for hours, but I've already taken up too much of your time, but I'd be really happy to answer any questions you might have. And also give me a chance to get a drink of water.
Okay, so I'm going to unmute all of the participants here. And if anybody has any questions, please feel free to ask your questions. Let's see. You should now be able to unmute yourselves if you want to ask a question.
Yes, Dr. Yohe, my name is Greg Laskowski. I was a supervising criminalist with the Kern County Crime Lab for a number of years. And although we never dealt with ancient mummies, we would encounter what we call more modernistic mummies. And one of the things that we would do to help identify these people was to, we would restore their fingerprints through a process. And I kind of developed a process that seemed to work. And when I was in Egypt in 2019, we were invited to the Chicago house, and I don't know if you dealt with those individuals.
Yes.
But I mentioned to the curator there at the Chicago house about this work that we had done to restore fingerprints from mummies, and I was kind of curious. I brought up the idea of maybe some of the noblemen or some of the mummies, their fingers could be restored using the process, and then they would be run on the FBI's next generation fingerprint system, and we could see, maybe do a study to see if these fingerprints would come up, because the argument is that all fingerprints are unique, so we shouldn't get a match even from 5,000 years ago.
Sure.
So I thought that'd be an interesting study. So
Yeah.
I didn't know if the mummies you encountered had fingers that might be or digits that might be worthy of let's just say restoring.
Sure. And I think that's a great idea. And that's the type of cross-disciplinary discussions that I think are so important, because someone in your profession, has an idea and you get an opportunity to share it. What was the reaction from the Chicago house folks?
Well, the curator there was very interesting. I think he was going to talk, is it Dr. Hawasi? I gave him my business card because he was talking about one of his colleagues was doing rehydrating the intestines. And so he was describing the unique, I guess we could call it aromas or odors that were emanating from that work to see what the diet was at that time. So, I mean, it's, like I said, it was in 2019. I hadn't heard back. Maybe it was just something of curiosity to them, but I just thought I'd bring it back up again.
No, it's a very interesting idea. And in fact, in the exhibit that'll be opening on the 20th that we put together, we actually do have a mummy hand, and at least the thumb and the index finger are so well preserved. I mean, the dermal ridges are under magnification are perfect. Absolutely. I bet you could easily take the fingerprint directly from that index finger and that thumb. We probably wouldn't want to do that because of the ink, but we could do it digitally, I think.
Exactly. Yeah, you could do that. Mhm.
And but yes, I think that's an excellent idea. I mean, I worked when I was a state archaeologist in Idaho. I did a lot of work with forensic services because they didn't have a physical anthropologist, and so I worked on a number of murder cases and death scenes where they were trying to figure out as much as possible about what the person might have looked like. I mean, in one case, we had some couple of duck hunters found a body. Well, first they thought it was a bag, and then they realized it was a preserved skin of a person, and it was full of bones. And so the coroner went out and collected that, and they called me in, and one of my colleagues, she had done exactly what you're talking about. In cases where they had preservation of the outer skin, what she would try to do is, wearing a glove, she would try to put the hand over her own hand so that she could see about getting a fingerprint or a thumbprint on it. And she was successful on several occasions, including this one. But I was able to determine, we were able to identify who it was because somebody had fallen off one of the local dams and had gone through the turbines. So we never did find her head or her left arm, but everything else was there, and all her skin was there, but all the organs and muscle tissue had decomposed. But she was able to get a direct fingerprint off of that. The only problem we would have with the mummies is that once you wet them, it becomes difficult to dry them without having them start to mold. One of the greatest problems when it comes to mummies, especially if you move them out of their ambient situation with low humidity, is you start to get formation of mold. But there is technology, I know now, that you can do the fingerprints digitally without having to do the old fashioned, using the ink and roller routine. So I think it's a brilliant idea, and it'd be great to take those data, and see if they get a hit. I mean, there's a potentially interesting statistical study for a graduate student there.
Well, the interest, I mean, what you were mentioning, and when we encountered these mummies, the fingers are so desiccated. So essentially what we're doing, we're putting them into a downy and salt solution, tips up for several days. And what happens is essentially what we're doing is turning a raisin into a grape.
Sure.
So that then the digits are soft and pliable and you can roll them. In the one instance we had, the thumb one of the thumbs was the best. This was up in the Isabella area. The thumb was one of the best digits. The unfortunate thing, there was a beetle hole at one part of the finger pad. So what we did was we like I said, we rehydrated it, and then we made a reverse cast using dental silicone, and then rolled that, reversed the image, and they weren't able to do it through what we call the Cal-ID system, but the deputies at that time had maintained some fingerprint files of individuals they had arrested up in the Isabella area, and it turned out that he was a high school wrestler, and so we're able to identify him via that method.
Yeah, no, that's in fact what I will do. I'm friends with Salima Ikram, who's considered to be the world's leading expert on Egyptian mummies. So if she knows, if anyone has done this sort of thing with mummies in Egypt, she'll know about it. So I have to talk to her anyway. So I will definitely mention that to her, because that's a very intriguing idea.
And then my wife's question was, and I don't want to belabor everything and take away from anybody else's time. She was wondering where all the linen had come from. In order, if you have 100 yards of linen, where was this basically manufactured? Or
Yes.
Yeah, one of the most common artifacts when you're digging a town site are spindle whorls. And a lot of people in the 19th and early 20th century made the assumption that all of this cloth was cotton, but it's all flax linen. And flax was one of the major crops that was used for a number of purposes, but one of the major purposes was to create flax linen from it. So, and it was hand spun using these. I mean, I've seen these spindle whorls used. I've never used one, but you can go onto YouTube and they may even have one that's specifically Egyptian.
Oh.
But the cloth was very expensive, which is one of the reasons that families would, if a family was going to have a child, they would immediately start collecting linen
Wow.
to, make a mummy for that child when they grew up. Or if they, died it was so common for, if they didn't die in childbirth, there's a really good chance they wouldn't make it to a second year. Because one of the issues, in addition to schistosomiasis, there's, dysentery is endemic as well. And one of the biggest health issues that faced the ancient Egyptians was dealing with dysentery on top of schistosomiasis. So, but yeah, it was made from flax. And the other thing flax was good for was, basically fodder for goats and sheep. So yeah, there was it was a part of a household custom that people would make their own linens, or in some of the larger cities where you had specialists, there were shops that spun flax linen and also would do things like make carpets and rugs, thatched rugs from palm leaves, things of that sort. So yeah, but it was expensive, which is why a lot of the mummies, especially the lower class mummies, have less. That image that I showed you was kind of an anomaly. That general was very wealthy in Egyptian terms, so the family could afford to purchase all that linen. I don't know why they went so overboard. To me, it seems like they went overboard. The mummies that we have only have about 5 or 6 layers of linen, which is still a lot of linen, especially when you're talking about linen the length of a body. And a lot of it was just a lot of patchwork in some cases, particularly with the individuals who were less wealthy. So yeah,
Thank you.
Cotton finally did come to Egypt, but it was much, much later. Like camels don't show up in Egypt until, around 2,000, 2,500 years ago. Before that, there were no camels being used in Egypt. And today, the most commonly used animal, as it was in antiquity by the local farmers, are these little donkeys.
Yeah.
They're amazing. First of all, they're really puny, but you'll see them not only carrying their owner, but 500 pounds of harvested grasses. I mean, it's just amazing. And when you look at since I identify the animal bones, I've yet to find anything that's camel, but I've certainly found a lot of sheep and goat and donkeys, lots of donkeys.
Okay.
Other questions?
I was curious if there had been any DNA tests done on any of the mummies.
Oh, I would love to do that. I mean, I've got a list of things that I would love to do. And the problem is politics, And they do have DNA labs, 2 DNA labs that were partially funded by National Geographic in Cairo, but I think both of them shut down after the Arab Spring. So I haven't heard anything about those labs since the Arab Spring, but I also heard that there were some problems with both those labs. I actually have someone I know, I served as an advisor on his dissertation committee that now is a professor in Illinois, and he runs an ancient DNA lab. And I've actually sent stuff to him before, but there's no way we can get any material out of the country to be able to do what we'd like to do. And with the lab shut down in Cairo, and even if we could get access to the labs in Cairo, the amount of red tape that one has to go through, I am sure it would take a couple of years before we got permission to use those labs. And I'd want to make sure that the labs were up to appropriate standards, because nothing against Egyptian scientists, but it's a matter of funding and support, because they can get this wonderful equipment, but then there's not a continual flow of money to keep that equipment maintained like it should be. So that's the conundrum. You know, that's why when we wanted to do the mass spec project, we had to, you know, lease one or rent one to take it to Egypt. And to get that into Egypt, it took 3 years of negotiating, simply because the term radioactive showed up in one of the documents. Because yeah, there's an isotope that is necessary for this to work. It doesn't mean that the thing is a thermonuclear device though, but anything that has the word radioactive really was a red flag to a lot of the Egyptian officials. So it took a lot of meetings and discussions, and there's the language barrier too. Fortunately, most people who are well educated in Egypt speak English, in addition to several other languages as well, which makes me feel like an idiot because I can barely handle French. I did start to learn Coptic though. So, but yeah, the problem is that we can't, all those special studies that we would like to do, the x-rays, for example, the only reason we were able to get x-rays on our mummies, initially we wanted to transport them to Cairo, but I was concerned about the vibrations, you know, damaging the mummy, especially the way that some Egyptian drivers drive. So,
Well, you
fortunately,
would think that they would want to put some money towards that kind of thing, just because they are so protective of everything. You would think they would want to start lineage and you know exactly who their ancestors are and who's still around.
and I think many people feel that way, but it depends on the politics of archaeology in Egypt. They're very complicated. You know, Zahi Hawass was, the king of archaeology in Egypt for so many years, but during the Arab Spring, they basically had a warrant out for his arrest. So he left the country. He's back now and he's running tours, but pardon me. It's hard to start. You have to start with, fortunately, there's this organization called the American Research Center in Egypt. So they kind of work on the behalf of researchers to try to get things done. But the only way we're able to get x-rays is fortunate that Salima Ikram, who I mentioned earlier, who's the mummy expert, she took the portable x-ray machine that the American University at Cairo has, actually took it down to our site and did our mummies for us. And she's has my greatest gratitude, because that, and I've since had, that's another thing on my list of things to do on my sabbatical, is to write up our X-ray studies, because we had 6 of the mummies X-rayed, and the X-ray data was very interesting, and also supported the fact that most of these individuals had big chunks of natron that they were packed in, just like NGLP7, which is what I assumed, but we've got evidence for it now. But remember that facility? I've got a lab. There's a lab that they use for cataloging, and then all those concrete buildings are for storage. And in 2006, I got funding to build a mummy storage facility. In fact, let me see. There it is. So in 2006, I got this grant. This is when they're just finishing this mummy storage room. And this is after they've completed putting the final layer of stucco on it. You can kind of see the bricks are still showing through because they're wet. And this is the only mummy storage facility in Middle Egypt. And every one of our mummies, you can see they're stacked on these metal shelves, and they're wrapped in modern fresh linen, and then wrapped in a polyester. All those rugs you see are really super popular in Egypt because they're inexpensive and they're made from polyester. And so, being inert like polyester is, there's no potential for that to damage the mummies. And then the other thing we have to do, and you can see that I've got a bag there of what look like little white balls, and yep, those are mothballs. So we use paradichlorobenzene to minimize any. We haven't had a problem with insects in the past, but just in case, we want to make sure these guys are well preserved. Guys and gals are both male and female. So yes, we've got a mummy storage facility, thankfully, and it turned out to be pretty bizarre, because when we showed up in 2009, we opened the door to the facility and there was a new mummy on the floor. I don't know if I've got that in. Oh, by the way, there's our villa, there's our van, and those are what the ferries across the Nile look like. If you were to see them dry dock, you'd say there's no way on earth that those ever going to float anywhere or be driven anywhere, but they do. It's truly miraculous. And then, yeah, the support facility. I guess I don't have images of that. By the way, the outline of the Byzantine cemetery we were able to define in 2007, and you can see the walls of it right here. So NGLP used to be right here. We filled it with empty barrels, sandbags, and sterile sand to stabilize, so there'll be no erosion in the pit. Unfortunately, after the Arab Spring, all those 55-gallon barrels had been dug up and carted off somewhere. So we're literally back to square one in terms of all the work that hard work we did in 2006 and 2009 was undone during the Arab Spring. So it's really kind of disheartening. Oh, and we did put in another trench, and we found, again, more individuals, but we also found the first infant mummies. And there's one right down there. I don't think I've got a close-up of him. There it is. And it too is mummified, but we left them in place. We backfilled over them to protect them. I'm not sure. And the thing is, they hadn't been looted previously because most of the local looters know that there's no grave goods with these particular burials. Maybe a few little bits and pieces, but not anything that anyone is going to sell on the black market. You know, a human mummy head can sell on the black market for $25,000. Seriously, I've seen them go for that price. I've even seen them at major auctions like Sotheby's and such. And yep, they'll go from anywhere from $15,000 to $30,000 for a mummy head. So when they're going for a price like that, unfortunately, that's impetus for the local looters to want to go damage the mummies. And that's exactly what happened to all the intact mummies that we had in BC 1. We estimated that within this cemetery, there's probably a total of at least 300 people. And there's no way we're going to take up 300 people. We've got a sample, and we may go back and take another sample that includes the infants. And there's also a child. We found a child burial too. So we've got a full range of ages now represented. But we decided these would be safer in the ground. Unfortunately, we didn't anticipate the revolution. Other questions?
Greg, do you want to go ahead with your next question?
Yes, just one, and that was, I saw that you used a portable X-ray fluorescence device, which obviously looks at, does an elemental analysis. And then I saw the cut marks into the skull, knowing that this, whatever tool or weapon, did you do, or have you considered using that tool to see what the makeup of the weapon or tool is that made the cut marks, if there may be a trace evidence transfer of the elements?
That's an interesting idea. And I would like to, in a perfect world, I would use our electron microscope that we have at CSUB. Because the nice thing about our electron microscope is, in addition to getting the details, because I want to take a look at to see that they are actually cut marks and not caused by some other phenomenon. And I've studied a lot of cut marks, and those do look like cut marks, but it'd be nice to have the tech to be able to look at them more closely. And then the nice thing about the electron microscope is it also has a mass spectrometer, so you could pick up if there's like residue from an iron or bronze knife, let's say, for example. So I mean, that's a really good idea. Unfortunately, they do make one of the great developments that has occurred in the last decade, and it's come down in price, is these wonderful portable microscopes that hook up right up to your laptop, and you can, they have a flexible neck, so you can magnify up to 1800 power. So that's pretty amazing, and it shows up on your screen. And of course, you can videotape it, and that's something that didn't exist or wasn't feasible in terms of cost until they started mass producing them in China about 5 years ago. So one of the things that will go with me the next time I go to Egypt is I bought another one. I've got one that I bought to use at school, and then I have another one that I bought to take with me to Egypt, because they're really inexpensive for what they do. I mean, they're less than $100, and which I thought initially when I bought one, it was going to be kind of a hokey thing for such a small amount of money, but it turned out to be absolutely incredible. And we used it in the analysis of the mummy arm that is going on display in our Egypt exhibit at the Buena Vista Museum. So it would be nice to, but as you stated, it'd be nice to have that mass spec data. Maybe again in the future, as technology changes, we might be able to work something out.
Dr. Yohe, this is Corey, the moderator. I actually have a question for you.
Sure.
I want to know, once you had done your examination of the mummy and had unwrapped him and done that analysis, what happens to him next? How is he stored or reburied or on display? Like where do you do with the human remains?
Remember I said I had we have the only mummy storage facility in all of Egypt, and one from 2006. There's me standing in front of it. You can see and these are the mummies. And these, those are the little bags of mothballs, PDB, that is meant to keep the insects out. So these will stay here because we have other studies that we want to do. And one of my good friends is, in fact, there's a picture, is a cardiothoracic surgeon. And here he is, he's using an endoscope to take some imagery inside the skull of NGLP7. So it was also because we had this technology that we looked at his lungs and his liver, which it appears all the organs were left inside, and they're amazingly all well preserved. I mean, the liver almost looked, I mean, it glistened. I was shocked. I mean, I've been part of a lot of autopsies and I've seen it all, but that was the last thing I expected to see, was a liver that was liver color. And the lungs were interesting because, you know, Keith, being a cardiothoracic surgeon, has done a lot of operations and heart transplants and valve repair and bypasses. And he said, this guy has the lungs of a man that smoked 2 packs of cigarettes for 40 years. So what caused that kind of soot buildup in his lungs? We have no idea, but we do have the potential, if we are able to use these endoscopes, to do less invasive examination and make our autopsies, if you will, our necropsies, still valuable, but not causing damage. Because the last thing I want to do is, you know, do your traditional autopsy on these bodies. We want to keep them as intact as possible. And with the endoscopes, there are a lot of natural openings that we didn't put in that are the result of insect activity and just desiccation. And that's what allowed us to get into the thorax so we could see the lungs and the liver. So more of that type of work is being considered. But yes, the money, the point is that these mummies still have research potential, and eventually we will probably contact the local Coptic church and see what they want, you know, done with the bodies, because they are definitively Coptic Christian. And interestingly enough, we found out that some of the Coptic people still use the same general area where we're working. Within about a mile of the Tell is where they still bury their dead. In fact, we thought the first year I was there, we saw some people out there and we saw dirt flying, and we thought, oh my gosh, there are looters out there. They're looting as we're standing on the Tell. So a few of the police and military guys went over there, and it turned out it was just a funeral, a Coptic funeral. And that was an area that had been traditionally used for, you know, time immemorial. And so that's probably, that whole area, as I said, is a necropolis from the eastern side of the Tell all the way to the mountains. Let's see if I can find it. You notice, notice all those holes? All of those holes are looted shaft tombs. And you notice the one that has the ladder sticking out of it's the one that we're working on. We called it LST1. And we worked on 2006. And this is the actual shaft. It's a short shaft. It's only a couple meters deep. And then this is the actual tomb. And inside of that are these huge stone sarcophagi. And what makes these particularly interesting is that they had to have been made from the native limestone, because there's no way that they could get these through that entrance. They just wouldn't fit. And they're made out of the same stuff that the walls are. And you can actually see the tool marks on the back walls, just like they were made yesterday. And on our based on what we know from the few artifacts, this has been completely destroyed by looters, which is why all the sarcophagi are empty. And this is just a plan drawing of the tomb. We do have these two galleries. We were going to go back in 2012, and one of my graduate students was going to use these two galleries for data for her thesis. It didn't happen because of the Arab Spring. And when I was there in 2017, there was so much that I was dealing with on the Tell that I didn't even get a chance to come and see what happened by crawling into this tomb, because I'm sure those galleries have now been completely destroyed. So like most places, we keep our mummies and try to preserve them best we can. And because it's arid in that general area, and because we have a protective room that's locked, it's double locked because there are metal doors on the outside as well. So that will allow us over the next 20 or 30 years to do all kinds of special studies as the technology improves. I mean, just during the time I've been an archaeologist, 42 years, there have been so many amazing developments that, you know, no telling what I can do in, you know, 5 years from now that I can't do today. So we always keep that in mind, future studies, because each one of these individuals has a story to tell. That's one of the interesting things about, you know, this is essentially forensic anthropology that we're doing here. And so over the course of time, we'll continue to study these individuals and any others that we see fit to recover. I recovered 2 other mummies in 2017 that had been pulled out of that had been looted, and they were both children. They're the most complete child mummies that we have. And sadly, their heads and hands had been removed as well. But I didn't want anything else to happen to them. So I brought them back to the facility and documented them, and they're there for our next visit. So that's a long-winded answer to your question, Corey.
No, it's very, very thorough. I appreciate that. It gave me both a short-term and a long-term answer. So thank you so much.
You bet.
Well, I would like to thank all of our participants who joined us this evening, and for your attention and for your great questions. And I'd like to give a special thank you to our expert, Dr. Yohe, for sharing with us all of your experiences and your knowledge on this topic. It's been very fascinating. And I'm sure that as the museum progresses, we will continue to have more Meet the Expert topics on your expertise here, especially with Egypt, especially with our new exhibit opening. Dr. Yohe has been an integral part of it. In fact, it would not have happened without him. So I encourage you all to please come see the new exhibit at the Buena Vista Museum. As a reminder, we do have a special sneak peek of it at our gala on November 19th, and tickets are still available to that event. And you will get to have a great night with Dr. Yohe and others. And we cannot wait to see you there. And thank you everyone for your time this evening. And we'll see you at the next Meet the Expert.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Corey. Look forward to seeing hopefully all of you at the gala.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.